Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, a city floating on the water, raised up on stilts of lumber, home to untold amounts of beauty and cultural heritage, and drawing millions of tourists every year. But the same water that defines Venice and gives it beauty is also its greatest enemy. Water wages a constant war of attrition on the foundations of its buildings, interspersed with full-fledged attacks during flooding. With increased ocean levels and inclement weather due to climate change, Venice's age-long battle against the water is becoming all the more difficult. The city had to find a way to adapt and to survive.
In particolare le persone anziane devono molto spesso spostarsi in altre aree della regione affinché il problema dell'alluvione non impedisca loro, in una città in cui ci si muove solamente a piedi e senza auto, di riuscire a completare le normali attività giornaliere, quindi andare a fare la spesa, andare dal medico, tutte queste cose a Venezia durante un'alluvione non si possono fare.
So, how do you defend a city from catastrophic flooding? You could raise the city, fortify its buildings and infrastructure, or you could block the source of the water. The latter is the approach chosen by MOSE. To do this, MOSE uses 3 gates, positioned at the 3 inlets to the Venetian lagoon. These gates are made up of a total of 78 mobile metal flood barriers. These lie flat in caissons, but can be filled with air and thus raised when damaging floods of 1.1 meters or higher are predicted. By blocking off all 3 inlets, the water level in the lagoon is prevented from rising, and the city of Venice stays safe from the largest, most destructive floods. High tides of up to 3 meters can be withstood, which far exceeds the historical maximum tide of 1.94 meters, resulting in an encouraging extension of the city's lease on life.
MOSE, however, is also criticized as outmoded, failing to adapt to the unique and complex environment it was meant to protect. Costs have escalated dramatically, eventually reaching a final investment figure exceeding 6 billion euros. Moreover, even after completion, annual operational costs are expected to be in the order of tens of millions of euros. Yet, the greatest cost could be the neglect of local knowledge. The Venetian lagoon is an aquapelagic assemblage, a space where island communities have developed a distinct culture and traditional knowledge based on direct, daily experience from the water. Fishers, for instance, understand the lagoon as a domesticated territory, equating it to a rich countryside. They have long been aware that even a pole makes a swamp, illustrating the delicate balance that must never be altered. Fishers had repeatedly stressed that changes to the currents and geomorphology, such as the excavation of the 15-meter-deep Petroli Canal in the 1960s, caused serious consequences for the ecosystem. They foresaw the same risks with MOSE. The engineering elite, however, ignored Fisher's complaints. Engineers exhibited an attitude of derision towards the Fishers and their associates, embodying a brusque and doctrinaire rigidity that stood in sharp contrast to the need for elasticity in the ever-changing lagoon environment. The failure of governance was therefore a failure of listening, marginalizing local populations and creating a case of cognitive injustice, where the concerns of those who live and work in the water were excluded from decision-making.
So, how did we get here? How did MOSE come about? Well, Venice has always had a unique and fragile relationship with water. For centuries, the rhythms of the lagoon defined life here, but by the mid-20th century, increased floods, also named acqua alta, began to take a much heavier toll. In 1966, a once-in-800-year flood caused untold amounts of damage to homes and heritage, and enough was enough. In 1973, the Italian state adopted a mandate to safeguard Venice, declaring it a site of national interest. This same mandate defined the executing institutions and their respective competences. The Italian state would physically protect and environmentally balance the lagoon. The region would prevent water pollution, and the municipality would promote economic prosperity. To fulfill these desired policy objectives, 8 years of deliberation and a further 11 years of experimentation resulted in the technocratic solution that is MOSE.
This idealistic policy, however, was quickly undermined by failed governance and corruption. Project execution was granted in a joint concession to a single group of companies, the Consorzio Venezia Nuova, or CVN. According to critics, establishing this effective monopoly carried the inherent risk of creating a vast mechanism of corruption. These predictions came violently true in June 2014, when the financial police arrested 35 people and placed another 100 under investigation for severe charges, including illegal party financing, tax fraud, and false billing. Opponents of MOSE used this legal scandal to argue that support for the project had been bought through bribes intended to secure consent or silence critics.
Però secondo me non è stato del tutto efficiente, molte persone sono contrarie a questo progetto, in particolare dal 2014 quando è fuoriuscito tutto uno scandalo relativo alla corruzione, molte persone lo sentono come una cosa imposta.
Even engineers who presented competing, rejected projects found their children hired by the CVN in implicit exchange. The fallout was dramatic. The CVN was placed under extraordinary administration, and the project, already decades in the making, suffered extreme delays. This scandal exposed a fundamental rift. The lofty policy of salvation was riddled with failure at the governance level, substituting transparent management with a complex web of financial deceit.
It's clear, then, that the idealistic, technocratic vision of MOSE has been diluted by the realities of scandal and corruption. Nonetheless, the project was completed in 2020 and underwent a test raising in July of that year. Just 3 months thereafter, it faced its first real-world test. A tide of 135 centimeters, high enough to have flooded the entirety of Piazza San Marco, was successfully withstood by closing the gates at all inlets until the water had subsided. Since this landmark show of strength, many more raisings have followed. The barriers have been raised more than 100 times since 2020, effectively preventing various degrees of flooding. Keeping Venice dry has further resulted in plentiful economic benefits, with one report estimating that between 211 and 464 million euros are saved annually as a result of MOSE's protection. This is in addition to immeasurable benefits from the protection of cultural heritage.
Unfortunately, the construction of MOSE has become perceived by some residents as a greater risk than the floods themselves. Large-scale excavations in the inlets, necessary to house its structures, render the harbor mouths deeper and narrower. This altered the natural circulation of currents, with greater amounts of water passing at higher speeds during peak tides. This has degraded the seabed and destroyed marine flora and fauna. Fishers describe the lagoon today as sick and a rapidly changing organism, citing the appearance of invasive species and the disappearance of native fish, changes they attribute primarily to invasive anthropogenic interventions. Furthermore, critics of MOSE, like the opposition committee No Grandi Navi, describe its successes as ephemeral. MOSE's core governance challenge lies in its long-term viability. MOSE was designed for a minimal number of closures per year. Yet, due to accelerating relative sea level rise from climate change, simulations show that under the worst-case scenario, the barriers could be required to close up to 57% of the year by the end of the century. This would result in almost a permanent separation of the lagoon from the sea. This frequent closure dramatically limits water exchange, posing serious impacts on the quality of the ecosystem. Given that Venice lacks an efficient sewage system, untreated wastewater is typically washed into the sea by tide. If the gates are permanently closed, this wastewater will stagnate.
The costs prevented by MOSE vastly outweigh its investment costs and lost port revenues, but this rational perspective is time-limited and overlooks ecological and human costs. A solution must not be about saving political face, but sustainably saving the city and its environment. This requires a profound revision of strategy. It means moving away from a hard engineering approach that tries to separate humans from nature. Experts suggest embracing alternative, softer solutions, such as the engineered uplifting of the city floor, and implementing a blue ethic of urbanism that promotes the entanglement of Venice and its watery world. One thing is clear. For the MOSE system to work long-term, people must be aligned in vision, especially in a place with such unique cultural heritage and community. Only through valuing local experience alongside technology can Venice achieve a sustainable equilibrium.